Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Jillian Forsberg, author of The Rhino Keeper. Jillian, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, let's start out with your debut novel here, The Rhino Keeper. What is it about, and what inspired you to write this novel about a rhinoceros?
So, The Rhino Keeper is about a real rhino in the 18th century named Clara, and she became one of the first animal celebrities known to history. She traveled with her keeper, Dumont Vandermeer, who was a Dutch sea captain, for about 18 years in the mid 18th century. And this is remarkable because most rhinos prior to Clara only lived about 6 months in captivity, but somehow her keeper kept her alive for those 18 years. She traveled the expanse of Europe all the way from London to the tip of Italy and everywhere in between. She enchanted peasants and kings and queens, and there was tons of art made from her, beautiful sculptures, paintings, broadsides, coins. She was kind of like the Justin Timberlake of her day, if you will, just super famous, super well known, and everyone wanted to see her when she rolled into town. Um, and I became inspired by this story in 2020. My husband and child and I were at a wedding, and it was October of 2020. So there's still some restrictions on COVID lockdowns and things like that. And our daughter at that time was 5. So we were trying to find socially distanced, acceptable things for her to do. And on the way home from the wedding, we saw a sign on the side of the road for a small zoo outside of Salina, Kansas called the Rolling Hills Zoo. We thought, hey, cool, a zoo, she's 5, it's outside, let's go. So we pulled off and we went in and we did all the normal zoo stuff. And then when we got to the rhino barn, I expected them to open the doors and there's these white or black rhinos, but instead there was one of the largest animals I have ever seen. His name was Joya. He was an Indian or greater one-horned rhino, and I was just awestruck. I was like hands in the air, like, what is that? It had never really occurred to me that I'd only ever seen African rhinos before, black and white. There are there are two smaller subspecies of rhinos in the Indian area. There's Nepalese, and then there's Indian rhinos themselves. But then there's also Javan rhinos, Sumatran rhinos, and then the big one in Asia, which is the greater one-horned Indian rhino. And I just Googled it immediately. Like, what is this thing? It's covered in plated armor. It's massive. It has tufted, furry ears. And I scroll down to the Wikipedia page and it says, for more information, see Clara the rhino. So I click on it and it's a stub article, which means it's kind of short. And I read about this rhino and I see some of the art made from her likeness and how she toured Europe and was super famous. And I'm like, cool, let me scroll to the bottom and see where the book is. Like, where is it? Can I read the novel that someone has written about her? And there wasn't one. There's one nonfiction book at that point in time by Glynis Ridley called Clara's Grand Tour. So I immediately added it to my cart on Amazon and I read it. And I just couldn't stop thinking about this dang rhino. She just captured me. And I think it's funny that she captured me in that way because she probably did the same thing in the 18th century when people saw her for the first time. So I read Glynis's book and I finished it by the end of 2020. And I kind of toyed with the idea of, what if I could do this, but I'd never written fiction before. And I kept researching and kept finding little snippets about her. And I kept stumbling upon little pieces of rhino art in my life. And it felt like Clara was just calling to me in that strange rhino whistle way that they do. And so I finally got brave and I contacted the author of that book, Glynis Ridley. And I had a phone interview with her, which I recorded in the summer of 2021 or 22. And I walked her through my ideas for the book, for the plot. And I felt like when she said do it, that she gave me the permission I needed to successfully write this book. So I finished it in 22, started looking for publishers in 23. And 3 years after I saw Joya the rhino at the Rolling Hills Zoo in Salina, I signed my publishing contract.
Tell me more about your love of animals, because a lot of us have gone to a zoo and seen a rhino, but we didn't end up following up on that and writing a novel Uh, you talked a little bit about what inspired you just by seeing this rare Indian rhino, but go into a little bit about your background and your love for animals and how that really invigorated you.
I was one of those little girls who collected horse figurines. And it was my dream to own a pony, and I always had a cat by my side when I was growing up, and my Siamese cat had litters of kittens throughout my childhood. And I've always been surrounded by animals. And in middle school and high school in a small town in southeast Kansas, I actually got into 4-H. And for people who aren't familiar with that, it's kind of an agricultural club for young people, and I got interested in the livestock part of that. So I showed sheep and goats at the county fair, at the state fair, at a national level, and I was pretty good at it, which was surprising for a kid who hadn't grown up on a farm at all. But sheep and goats became my hobby, and every night in the summer we would drive out to this beautiful little farm in Hyattville, Kansas, and I had two people who are very dear to me, Mark and Diane Brillhart, who taught me the ways of husbandry with goats and sheep. And I actually ended up getting a scholarship for livestock judging for my community college days. I discovered pretty quickly that while I loved animals, the husbandry side of things and making that my career wasn't something that I was interested in doing. I wanted more companion animals instead of working animals, breeding animals, or meat animals. But when you have a lamb every year from sixth grade until your senior year of high school, and then you have a goat, and then you have a breeding ewe who makes babies that you have that lamb, I had grandchildren of my original lambs that I showed and cared for. They leave this indelible mark on your heart. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. I'm sure everyone listening to this can think of an animal that they loved. And I think that that is something that continues back through the past that we often don't think about. Historical animals don't really have voices. It's difficult to know what their lives were like, how they were treated, and who loved them. But when I came across this story, it was very evident to me who loved Clara. And that was her keeper and the people in the portraits around her. And in talking to modern rhino keepers, rhino care is a little more complicated than people might think. But the one answer that kept coming from them when I asked, how could this man with no husbandry knowledge, very little information about the species, keep her alive for 18 years? And they all just kind of pause and they think about it. And they're like, gosh, her diet was so poor. He didn't know anything. He had no vet care. They must have been bonded. And that answer kind of propelled me into the motives for the main character and that connection that we all have to animals that we love in our life and what that means for us as a species and what it means for this planet overall. I mean, we share this planet with animals, and it's really important to realize the impact that both, human and animal can have, not just in our society, but in this environment and what we do as a society as a whole when we respect or disrespect creatures.
And who is that man? Who was the Rhino Keeper?
The Rhino Keeper. Ah, gosh, he's an incredible person in my mind's eye. And unfortunately, he did not leave behind a captain's log or a journal or letters. We have a few copies of his signature, which I've saved to my phone, and I look at them quite often. And there's this beautiful, like, brown scrolling ink signature that I stare at. There's land deeds, there's a marriage certificate. His name was Dew, and his first last name was Mott, Mout, and he gave himself the title Vandermeer. Eventually, he becomes Baron Dumont Vandermeer, and he was a ship captain for the Dutch East India Trading Company. He joined when he was 15 years old, and life for a lot of sailors in the 18th century was pretty brutal, but he did end up clawing his way up the ladder of the VOC, which was one of the largest organizations in the world and one of the first multi-million dollar businesses in existence. He did become a ship captain. And after becoming a ship captain, when you start as a 15-year-old boy, you have to wonder, why would you give up something like that? Like, you finally made it to the top. This is as far as he could probably climb. He's in charge of a ship that's a really good ship, and he abandons that for an animal. And to our knowledge, when you look at the primary documents, he had no prior history with caring for animals like this. So why did he do this? That was one of the things that propelled me forward in the novel is what was his reasoning? Did he think he was going to make a fortune? Did he feel a particular pull toward this creature? Did he become subject to that 18th century wow factor where everything unique is more important than the things that are not unique? Unfortunately, we don't know the real answers because there are so little primary documents left by him. But what we do know is that he is pictured over and over with Clara throughout her journey through Europe. So you can kind of take those things and roll with them and create this story that comes from his stops and how his picture changes and how his titles and maybe his motivations change as well.
So this is a dual timeline narrative. You've told us now about Clara and about Dew. What is the other timeline and how does it fit into the story of Clara and Dew?
I was asked very early on in my writing process if I felt that this story would make sense to people who had little or no knowledge of the 18th century. The 18th century, we think about the end of it a lot. All of the revolutions that came about in 1776, it's the American, and in the 1790s, it's the French Revolution, and there's Haitian revolutions in there too. And things happen at the end of that century that are the product of centuries before in the earlier century. I know those things because I have a master's degree and I spent a lot of time studying the 18th century. My master's degree is based in the 18th century. My thesis is based in the 18th century. So I spent so much time just studying societal norms and things like that, that it's very common and understandable for me. But what if there's a person out there who's interested in Clara's story that has no idea what it was like to be in the 18th century? And I thought, what's the best way to explain this to them? And the answer is through a modern timeline where a young person is discovering Clara's story on her own. The other thing I felt was very important was to include modern conservation efforts in this. And it's difficult to do that when you're in 1740 and they have no idea that taking an animal out of its natural habitat is actually a really bad idea. But we know that today. And we also know today that the myth of a magical rhino horn is completely false. Rhino horn skin, body parts have absolutely no medicinal property and purposes. And yet it's still smuggled across, country lines, and people will pay tens of thousands of dollars for a rhino horn. That has become really important for me to talk about because these large mammals need our care to survive. So the modern part of this story is both self-discovery and a young woman named Andrea who has escaped something, a very uncomfortable relationship situation to try and find herself. But she's also discovering, how did people treat animals in the 18th century? How do we treat the legacy of an animal today? And I was told when I was writing that part, put yourself into it. How would you feel if you discovered a historical grave that no one knew existed, and buried in it was something that would change history? And that was really fun for me to write. I really enjoyed Andrea's story and getting to experience the emotional connection she had to discovering what was in that grave, discovering what that meant for the museum she works at, and discovering all the artifacts that go along with Clara's existence. Just like I did on my journey of writing this story, I found, a little enameled locket with a prince drawn on it, and he was holding a book, and on the book was a rhino. I discovered the portrait of a lady, and in the background is a lamp with a rhino on it. All of those are Clara. How would someone feel if they discovered those things? I could answer that question because I'd done it myself. So I wanted a modern reader to connect not just with this past timeline, but with this modern timeline of what if I found something really important in an 18th century desk or a document or a painting that had never been seen or an unmarked grave. And I rolled with that into this, I think, a really fun and fast-paced adventure in that modern timeline.
You mentioned that you had never written fiction before writing this novel and that you also have a background in history. Tell me about how you took that leap from history to fiction and how you were able to create a fictional narrative without having that background in fiction writing.
I think a lot of that has to do with how much I read. I was one of those kids in the 8th grade. I read a book a day. That librarian, she knew I was coming at 9 a.m. to take my accelerated reader tests, and she had the next book lined up for me. So I've been an avid reader my whole life. I devour books. And I think if you want to go into a fiction craft, reading is just important as writing. You need to understand how a character really feels. And that's something that in history we can't really assume unless they write down their feelings or emotions and we have a primary document about that. We can only assume through a filtered lens of the 21st century, looking back at their time. So history was really important to me to write. And I remember my first history class sitting through it in college going, this is amazing. I felt like I was, listening to a People magazine from, the 1600s. Like, this is great. I love this. And I loved writing history. And I also hated getting stuck. If your sources in history don't give you what you need, sometimes you're just stopped. You can't make things up. You can't, in a term paper for your history class, say, well, we think what happened next was. And I also think, from a perspective of someone who's been in public history for a while, history is always filtered through the lens of the viewer. So even though we have primary documents, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person's story is going to be the same as the person standing right next to them based on their own timelines, their own life experiences. So I knew that in writing this, I couldn't write it as a history book. I wanted to know what happened in between the pieces that we already knew. And I will tell you that from writing a master's thesis to writing a fiction book, the fiction book was much more enjoyable. I could make stuff up. I could assume their emotions and their feelings and fill in those gaps instead of saying, well, for 20 years, we don't know what happened. I could, squeeze in. I know that they were on this place in the European map. And so I think that they probably stopped at this city. I have one broadside that has Clara on it from a small town in Germany. Let's make up something that happened there and look into the history of that town. I think something else that really helped me was I participate in these short story contests. And at the end of 2021, I placed in a short story contest called NYC Midnight. And I hadn't written anything in years. And I think motherhood and working full time kind of tamps down your writing sometimes, but I hadn't written anything in probably a decade for myself. And when I entered into that short story contest and I got third place, I suddenly realized this does bring me a lot of joy, and I have permission to write for myself, and I have a permission to write fiction. I don't have any formal training. I just have, however many years of reading dozens and dozens of books, and loving the craft and loving history at the same time.
Tell me more about that journey. This is your debut novel, and it is quite a learning experience to go through the whole publishing process, querying process, writing process. Tell me about some of the challenges along the way and what you've kind of learned that you never expected to learn.
I think one of my biggest challenges was getting too big for my britches really fast. When I finished, I'm putting air quotes around that. When I finished this book, it was like 140,000 words. And there's all this gorgeous backstory about the ship captain and his childhood and what happens when he, gets onto the boat for the first time. And I'm probably going to release that as a short story at some time. But I don't need that in the narrative of the Rhino Keeper. And when I started, really writing a query letter and figuring out where I want this thing to land, I had one big goal in mind. And I think it's important for writers to have one big goal. My goal wasn't, I have to find an agent, I have to find a publisher, I have to find XYZ. My goal, very clearly in my mind, was I want a book in my hands. And I think that if that's the goal, it doesn't matter how you get there. You can indie publish, you can self publish, you can get a big five deal, you can go with a smaller, medium sized press. But I wanted that book in my hands. So that was my goal the whole time. I discovered pretty quickly through some personalized rejections, which I hear are very rare in the querying process right now, that A, my word count was too high. And B, some people didn't like the dual timeline narrative, but I liked it. And I was willing to compromise on some things. And that's the other thing, like if you're going to get personalized feedback, you do have to take it all with a grain of salt and decide, is this for me? Or is this something that I don't need to apply to my work? So I started really seeking an agent and publisher in earnest in March, late February, March of 2023. And, my first full request was from Barack Obama's literary agent, and I hadn't even queried her. And that was like a, oh my gosh moment. Like, what just happened to me? I got a very nice personalized rejection 8 days later, but that one request told me, kid, you can do this. Has merit enough to find a home. So I sent out probably 60 queries. I had about a 12% request rate, which right now in 2024 is a very good request rate for anything. People are floundering in the query trenches. And I felt that. And I also, had to find a way to take these rejections and turn them into something that was palatable for myself. And so I started doing what I call my rejection project. And I've seen a few people do this afterward. I was in my therapist's office talking about all these rejections, and she's so supportive of me. I love her. She would say things like, "You can't give up. You wrote a whole book." I said, "Well, yeah, I can give up at any time." She goes, "No, you really can't. That's not an option for you because you would regret it your whole life if you gave up." She says, "So find a way to turn your rejection into something that you can tolerate." So I literally went to the antique mall and started wandering around. I was looking for maybe like a canvas or something. I don't know why I thought painting was my thing. I'm not a painter. But I found this piece of white picket fence and I'm looking at it right now. And every rejection I got, I started painting a flower. And it's turned into 60 plus flowers, a little bumblebee when I got rejected for a mentorship project. It's gorgeous. And so when I got a rejection in my email, I would force myself to go to my back bedroom, sit down, get my paints out, focus on nothing else except for creating something beautiful in front of me. And then I went to the Historical Novel Society's North American Conference in San Antonio in June of 2023. I met up with a friend there. Her name is Kate Kavari. She's a wonderful writer. And she said, "What are your goals?" And I said, "Well, by the time the next conference rolls around in 2025, I want to have either a book deal or a finished book." And she revealed to me that she had queried for a really long time and that those are really good goals, but I did have to be realistic. I just had this fire under me that this story was not mine anymore. This was Clara and Du and Andrea's story. This has nothing to do with me. Du and Clara were real and their bond was real. And they deserve to have this told to an audience who has no idea that they existed. And that made me really sad to think that maybe more people, would never be able to experience what he had experienced with the wonder of meeting an Indian rhinoceros. So I just kept going. And in the end, I did sign with History Through Fiction in October of 2023, and I painted an acceptance. I painted an acceptance butterfly. And that was one of the best moments of my life. And I took my contract to the Sedgwick County Zoo where I signed it in front of my rhino buddy. His name is KJ. He knows me. I can call his name across the field and he'll come running over thinking that I have like a watermelon for him. I don't. That day I just had my publishing contract, which was one of the best moments of my life. So it was a long journey, but I think what I learned there was everything is subjective. Some person might love this. Some people might say this is not for me. And that's going to be the same for readers, writers, and everything in between. An agent who says they love your book may not be able to sell it. So what is, if you have a goal as a writer, what is your goal? If your goal is a book in your hands, then that's a great goal. If your goal is to get an agent, what's your end game? So it was a really long and arduous journey in my mind. But in reality, I have a book in my hands less than a year after I signed my publishing contract. And from concept to book in my hands, just that glimmer that I got at the zoo in Salina, Kansas, it's been 4 years. And I know some people fight for 20 or 30 to get their books out there. So while I feel like in my heart of hearts it was a long journey, it really wasn't. So
Well, we love the story, obviously, at History Through Fiction, and we're so grateful that you submitted to us, and we think your readers will love it too, and that's why we partnered with you to publish this novel. So, congratulations on all that hard work and dedication that you put towards this, and to just keep going. And your journey is just as valid as any other author's journey, no matter how short or long it is.
Thank
Uh,
you.
let's talk a little bit beyond that because now, as we speak today, the novel hasn't quite come out yet, but we're beyond the editing phase and we're into the marketing phase. You have, I would say, quite a knack for your online presence, for your social media platforms, for just kind of putting yourself out there, whether it's in writing or in your business or in your personal life, and also being supportive of other authors out there that are on that same journey. Can you talk about what it means beyond the page, beyond the writing, beyond the research, beyond the editing, to actually going out there and finding your audience and growing your presence so that more people can find out about this novel, can find out about this history, and so that you can kind of be more than just a writer, you can be an author.
That's been one of the funnest things about this is supporting people who are not where I am yet, and also being pulled up the ladder by people who are well above me in their publishing journey. I think it was Sarah Pinner who described to me that, this journey of publication is a ladder, and there will always be people below you, and there will always be people above you, and you have to extend your hands both way. When you do that, you create this chain reaction of this person who's writing their book right now, who's emailed me or is like, "Hey, can I schedule a Zoom call with you?" Yes, I will pull you up. And I might not meet you where you are, and you might not meet me where I am, but we have things we can learn from each other, regardless of where you are in your author journey right now. And then the people above me, they have readers, and I desperately want readers. I want people who are going to message me or DM me or comment on my blog post and say, "I can't believe this happened to this character. How could you do this?" Or, "Hey, I really want to know more about XYZ," or, "What's coming next from you?" I crave that so much, and I think it's because I love this story so much. But it's been a really fun time to be able to create a world around the Rhino Keeper that is unlike anything anybody's ever read. I've never read a book about an 18th century rhino. Well, I have, but it's nonfiction. So there's magic in this. And even though it's historical fiction, it does feel very special. I want people to feel that specialness in their own lives too. And I think that's why I do things in such a varied way. People will see me post about Clara and rhinos. People will see me post about 18th century and traveling to Europe. People will see me posting about, my child or my life or my cats, which are just close to me as Clara and Dew are to each other. And they'll also see me post about my vintage fashion and my store that I run. And I think, someone said to me the other day, "You have such varied interests. How do you keep them all straight?" Well, they make up the puzzle of who I am. And I think each author does have these pieces that create this interesting piece of personhood that everyone can connect to, whether that's in their personal life or their writing journey or the books that they put out or the books they dream of putting out. Um, the the thing that I was told early on by a mentor of mine, Jenna Blum, was don't ever stop talking about your book. Find one interesting thing that you think other people might connect with. Find five more. Um, find an image that goes along with it. Find a place you want to go and go there. And hearing her say that has really put this fire under me that once again, it's not my story. This is Clara and Dew's story, and they deserve this history to be told. And when I find interesting things about it, and I'm really fascinated to go on that, Wikipedia deep dive like I do. I think it's great to have people join in with that nerdiness. Like, what the heck? Why is she posting about this? Because it's interesting and cool. And I think that that's some of the things that I like to post about the most is what are these things that other people can connect with that happened in the past? And that's why we write historical fiction anyway. So that's been really fun.
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting. Can
You're
you
good.
talk? Can you talk a little more about your life outside of writing? I think people are very kind of interested in what independent authors do outside of their work and the fact that they do have to expand into other things in order to keep a balance and maintain life as an author. So talk about your bridal store and just some of the ways that you support yourself, or both maybe financially, but also just personally, so that you have that work-life balance.
Yeah, I've worked in the bridal industry for 17 years. When I was in college in McPherson, Kansas, I walked into a store and I needed a part-time job just to get me through college. I had a little bit of retail experience in high school, and so they hired me, and I just worked there Saturdays and, part-time throughout my career in McPherson College. When I graduated, I came to Wichita, Kansas to get my master's in public history. And I once again found myself like, how can I get myself through grad school? And I walked into every single bridal store in town, and only one called me back. And fast forward 14 years later, I now own that store. It's Dress Gallery in Wichita, Kansas. And I looked just from 2018 to see how many brides I personally have helped find their dresses, because that's how far back my history goes through my digital records. So since 2018, I've helped over 1,100 brides find their gowns. And it's very overwhelming sometimes to think about how many people I've helped, but being part of someone's love and memory, and I always say to people, those are the photos that are going to be passed down generation after generation. Those are the objects, those are the gowns that don't get thrown away. There's memory and love and emotion tied into the seams of every bridal gown that walks down the aisle. And oftentimes my friends in the public history world will be like, well, why didn't you go further into public history? And I said, but I am. And instead of going into the past, I'm going into the future. I'm thinking about those brides 2 generations from now who will say, my mother got her gown there, and they have it still preserved in their house in a gorgeous box, and they have the wedding photo next to it. I'm thinking about the grandchildren who only exist because of that union that I helped dress that person for. So my store is very important to me, not just because it's my full-time job, but also because it helps me create beauty in my own life. Um, my work-life balance, I feel like I have a routine down. I am so strict with myself sometimes, but I think it's good. It gives me joy. Most mornings I'm up at 6. I'm in my little back bedroom workout room by 6:30. I exercise for 30, 40 minutes. By 7 a.m., I am at my computer and I will write from 7 to 8, or I will work on my writing. Like yesterday, I just did research on my third book because I'm not quite to that phase of like, I can really write this yet. So for that hour, I dedicate myself to my author journey. If I have a day off and I don't do that, I'm like, oh, I could write all day today. I don't. I clean the house. I play with my cats. I go out in the garden and putter around. But if I have that strict hour where it's like, this is your only hour to get this done today, then I get it done. My child is in elementary school, and she's usually asleep at that time. So it's also a good time for me to just focus on the things I want to focus on, exercise my brain as well as my body and my heart and my mind. And then I can move on to my work day at the store. And then I come home, and sometimes I'll have Zoom calls. Like last night, I had a Zoom call with my critique partners, which was really fun. And sometimes I'll just watch American Idol on the couch with my family. And sometimes we'll take our little dogs on a walk around the neighborhood. But I had a friend the other day ask me, how can you do both? How can you dedicate yourself to writing and authorship and creating books and fiction and also own a store? And the answer was very clear to me, because without one, I cannot do the other. If I just had my store and couldn't focus on writing or disappearing into the 18th century, I would not feel whole as a person. I would feel this great chasm existed, and I wouldn't be able to thrive in my daily life. And if it were the opposite and I only had my books and I didn't have my store, I think that my personal need to be out of the house would also not be satisfied. During 2020, I think a lot of people realized if they could work from home or not. I am not one of those people. I could never exist solely in this house without a job outside of it. So, knowing that balance in my life and finding that in my mid 30s has been great. And I know that those healthy habits that I'm creating will not only set a great example for my child, and they bring me closer to my husband as he, sets my cup of coffee down beside me every morning while I'm writing. It also creates a legacy for my future, where now, after finishing a book in 22, I've already written another one and I have a third one in the works. So it's really fun to watch both careers kind of grow at the same time.
I think you offered a lot of really great advice there, and it sounds like you have established a good, healthy routine. Maybe you should give a TED talk on it.
maybe.
What are you working on?
Well, my second book is off to beta readers right now. I literally just put one in the mailbox, and that one is I'm really excited about my second book. My second book is based on another real historical person, and they are in the Rhino Keeper, and it was another one of those lightning strike moments where you're like, "What is this? Why have I never heard of this? This person is incredible. Their work is incredible." It's based on the true story of a porcelain maker in the 18th century. His name was Johann Joachim Candler. He lived in Dresden, worked in Meissen. He worked for an absolutely insane king. And by insane, I mean, rumors are saying this guy had 300 bastard children. He died after a large party, like drinking, and he had a very strange work life balance where pleasure and ambition collided. And he did a lot of great things for the city of Dresden and a lot of great things for the arts, but he was not a nice person. And he asked this porcelain maker to create a porcelain menagerie for him, life-size animals out of what they called white glass, white gold. So unfortunately, you can't do that in 18th century porcelain. He wanted a life-size rhino. He wanted a life-size unicorn. He wanted a life-size sculpture of himself on a horse, all made in porcelain. But life-size things like that explode in the kilns. And if you have a king who demands something of you without any knowledge of how porcelain actually works, how can you, as the artist, gently let him down? So there's a lot of conflict there, but I also discovered one of his mistresses was a really interesting woman. And of all the mistresses that this terrible king ever had, he only left one of them anything in his will. And when I saw that, I said, who is she? So her story is woven into this from a second point of view, 20 years before the porcelain maker comes into Dresden. And so that book is off to betas. I love it. I think it's a really fascinating story. And then my third book, I'm kind of keeping under wraps for now. It's a huge concept. I'm going back to ancient history, back into, I worked in museums for a while and I held cuneiform tablets in my hands. And once again, I was struck by lightning on my way to work one morning. And I said, I've got to write that concept down. The title of the book came to me, a character came to me, the concept came to me like a boom. And that was like last summer. And I'm like, you have to get your second book finished before you can start on your third. So now I'm about 2,000 words into that third book. My critique partners last night were like, this is incredible. I'm like, good. Fingers crossed. I know how to write ancient history and we'll get there when we get there. But I think it's been great to figure out what's coming next for me. And I don't have a dry spell. That's been really exciting for me to not have a dry spell in my writing and to just continue to find things that energize me to write about.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to reading your next manuscript and reading, just seeing all the work that you come out with. Obviously, I'm really excited for the Rhino Keeper coming out here soon with History Through Fiction. Jillian, congratulations on the Rhino Keeper, and thank you so much for chatting with me today. I always love talking with you.
Thanks, Colin. It's really a joy to be part of your team and to be part of your podcast.